Welcome back to Screen Blast Repeat. It's been a while since my last video, which ended up at 1 hour and 32 minutes for the history of avant-garde metal part 2B. That video covered the rise of experimental black metal in the 1990s and orthodox death metal in the same decade, and the offshoots from grindcore, which ultimately culminated in mathcore at the end of the 1990s. And of course, I looked at the Meshuggah records of this period because nothing was more experimental than the music of the Swedish giants at the time. We just didn't know it, did we? My plans for part 3 are to split it into different sections like I did with part 2. The period under the lens in this series will be the year 2000 through to 2009. This documentary will also double as a history book, and it's getting longer and longer. I'm going to start part 3A with a look at the English avant-garde metal scene of the first decade of the 21st century. England had contributed very little to experimental metal in the 1980s and 1990s, though there were some exceptions. However, the 2000s were a fruitful period for genre-bending music in the home of heavy metal, and today we're going to examine that in more detail. If you haven't already seen them, I encourage you to watch the 3 previous videos leading up to this one. So my aim is to write the most comprehensive study of avant-garde metal in the world ever. If you like this content, you'll enjoy the videos that I've already completed. These are the history of avant-garde metal, part 1, 1985 to 1992. The history of avant-garde metal, part 2A, 1993 to 1999. And the history of avant-garde metal, part 2B, 1993 to 1999. Thank you for selecting this documentary. I hope you discover some new artists and learn more about the history of experimental metal music. This is an ongoing project that'll take at least 18 months to complete. It's already taken on a shape and structure of its own that I hadn't really envisaged, and I've decided not to chase the YouTube algorithm by publishing each episode at a set time every 2 weeks. Doing this will compromise the quality of my work, and I know it'll be better to publish the videos when they're ready, not when a deadline dictates that they must be ready. So let's start part 3A in England at the turn of the millennium. This is the history of avant-garde metal, part 3A, 2000 to 2009. Akakoki formed from the ashes of London death metal group Salem Orchid, where Jason Mendonca and David Gray helped to cement extreme metal in England's capital city with several well-received demos in the early 1990s. Arriving on the scene in 1998, their new band self-released their 1999 debut LP, Rape of the Bastard Nazarene, and won immediate praise and attention for daring to give death metal a licentious dimension anchored in the occult. Cannibal Corpse, this was not. It's easy to see why their mix of Mortician's grisly death metal and Celtic Frost's operatic pomp would generate a buzz in extreme metal circles. Sampled diatribes and sermons insert themselves into the blast beats and rapid tremolo riffs as easily as the deadpan grunt vocals of Mendonca. Coquettish female dialogues appear like guiding owls in the night. No 2 songs are the same on Rape of the Bastard Nazarene, with Margareta and Gretchen imitating the fashionable drum and bass patterns of the time for its main beat before transitioning into a concupiscent skirmish of non-repeating death metal rhythms. Justine pays homage to the virtuous heroine of the Marquis de Sade's most famous novel and uses beguiling keyboard drums to suck you into its embrace. Often, the drums sound like sticks hitting kitchenware, and the guitar solos are as unmusical as Slayer on the 50th show of a world tour. Undoubtedly, the demo quality of the recording was its greatest charm with the limitations of 1999's home technology. Terrorizer magazine listed Rape of the Bastard Nazarene at number 20
in their top 40 albums of 1999, which was unusual even for them to pick a self-released record. It grabbed the attention of Peaceful Records, who signed them for 2001's The Goat of Mendes. Here they took advantage of a bigger budget and expanded their devious Liberty manifesto to 56 minutes. Now you could hear the drums bludgeon their way through the mix, with Martin Bonsoir drafted in to add keyboards and cello. Album number 2 embraced the ear-piercing shriek of black metal and returned the brutality of death metal. In between, the satanic incantations alternated between inhumane grunting, wild screaming, and choral harmonies. Like Emperor, Akakoki recognised the dimensional power of sound design in this chaos, mainly from sampling software and an imaginative library of keyboard presets. Dissonant trumpets and clarinets hum behind the scenes of the record like the belly rumble of a deity waiting for its sacrificial offerings. Efforts as ambitious as Horns of Baphomet and Ceremony of Nine Angles hinted at the first sign of the band's flirtation with post-punk music, albeit grounded in a noisy tech metal frenzy that could self-implode at any moment. The Goat of Mendes is now a seminal record in the development of blackened death metal. The hybrid genre has its detractors and its celebrants. Those that dismiss it are often purists who lament that there is no place for the music of deicide in a black metal setting. In their view, these artists use the imagery and controversy of black metal to draw attention away from the asinine nature of death metal. This criticism does not have Akakoki in mind, though it overlooks the avant-garde aspects of their art. Songs like He Is Risen are malevolent offerings punctuated with villainous laughter and imperious trumpets. Breaking Silence has as many riffs and time changes as Gorguts. They refuse to let one track on this LP settle into the comfort of a simple headbanging piece of metal. Its devotional nature is daring yet exhilarating. The mainstream rock press praised it and the underground metal community lauded it. Akakoki were on many lips as a band that might hold the future of extreme metal in their hands. They signed to Earache Records for 2003's Corazon and delighted in the digital technology available to them to thicken the sound and separate the instruments with more clarity. Of course, this was still heavier than a buffalo on eggshells. Opener praised the name of Satan, flavoured the egregious extreme metal with sporadic killing joke passages, while Leviathan revealed a new melodious side to the vocal arrangements over chugging guitars and dreamy arpeggio sequences. Like Dird Heimsgaard's transformation on 666 International, Akakoki discovered how the power of heavy, syncopated guitars could leave more space in the songs, and that meant more attention to the slithery Stravinsky moments. Jason Mendonca's ability to project his sermons with increasing hysteria gave the music a dramatic element absent in most extreme metal at the time, but that did not mean they'd left the savage death metal behind. Songs like Enraptured by Evil were as close to orthodox as you might expect from a band that prided themselves on intoxicating the listener in a world of satanic intrigue. Yet to contrast these, they embedded a new aesthetic into the sound based around devotional singing and dissonant guitar intervals. Valley of the Crucified captured it all in one track with its dizzying riffs, animalistic vocal noises, blast beats, mid-tempo passages, and arms to the sky singing. Though shorn of its horn furnishings and melodramatic soprano vocals, Corazon was at the cutting edge of experimental metal for the way it revelled in surprises. Christianity was not the enemy here, the nemesis was tedium, and Akakoki ensured no listener would suffer from it, despite blasting their way through music that 99% of the world's population would, let's be honest, probably detest if forced to listen to it. With new metal on its way out, the mainstream metal press hoped to find the next innovation. For a brief spell, it looked like they might settle on Akakoki's brand of experimental extreme metal. Kerrang! Magazine and Rock Sound named Corazon in their end-of-year best-of lists, and longtime supporters Terrorizer awarded it the coveted Album of the Year for 2003. It was the height of the group's cultural impact. London now had an official scene for extreme metal, and the gatekeepers and tastemakers wanted to be let in. When guitarist Paul Scanlon departed at the end of the year, it made sense for the Australian Matt Wilcock to take his place after leaving Akakoki's label mates, the Berserker, to relocate to England. The cycle of releasing an LP every 2 years now dictated the band's schedule, and they stuck to it with admirable determination. 2005's Words That Go Unspoken Deeds That Go Undone, continued the refinement of the audio production without sacrificing the extremity of the music. This is the record where Akakoki embedded sorrowful singing as a mainstay of their mature progressive metal sound. The vituperative black metal still formed part of its core, but they changed their guitar settings to a crunchy neo-thrash tone and widened the space in the compositions. All but one of these came in below 5 minutes, though the 10-minute epic Shelter from the Sand represented a new high point in their experimentation. Part Edge of Sanity, part Tangerine Dream, and built around Gang of Four guitar shapes, it showcased their prog credentials. Cradle of Filth for adults might be one way of describing it, and could explain why the group struggled to penetrate youth culture like the Suffolk Superstars. Commercially, it did nothing, reaching number 73 in the UK album charts. The satanic gentry image of sharp suits and sunglasses did not speak to rebellious teenagers, but it resonated with critics. After all, extreme metal did not belong in the mainstream, nor should it aspire to have its place in the sun. The fifth album arrived as expected in 2007, but they stopped the clockwork release schedule and dithered towards a breakup in 2012. As the last full-length recording in the group's golden period of the noughties, Antichrist was overshadowed by a pre-release concert in Belfast in May 2007, which attracted the attention of Northern Ireland's Protestant and Catholic hardliners for its explicit satanic veneration. Mendonca and Gray appeared on BBC Northern Ireland to debate the critics from the religious establishment, but did not get the serious forum they were promised and ended up on the wrong end of verbal abuse for most of it. It ought to have been free publicity and a boon for the upcoming album release, yet the condemnation left them bruised. Nevertheless, the specialist music media agreed on one thing. This was a tremendous record let down by a substandard audio production flattened at the height of the loudness wars. Musically, Antichrist contrasts the blood-soaked death thrash action with moments of luscious meditation and souls them into a mystical paradigm where the pleasures of the flesh hold the key to eternal felicity. It was their last release of the 2000s and their most progressive. There's no doubt that Akakoki ruled the English extreme metal scene in this era. Another artist that emerged in this period on the Earache Records roster was English multi-instrumentalist James Fogarty, aka Mr. Fogg. His Ewigkeit project started as a bedroom endeavour at age 16, culminating in the release of 3 demos between 1995 and 1996. Even from the start, Ewigkeit looked beyond black metal for its sustenance, something that's evident in 1997's Battle Furies debut, which received a release on the short-lived record label Elderthorn. Always intrigued by the sound design of electronics and fascinated by atmospheric keyboards, Fogarty composed most of his debut LP from solid palm-muted guitars and growled vocal inflections. On top of this, he created parts for female singing, sorrowful pianos and trance synths, and programmed his drums with double kick drum patterns befitting of any black metal band. The guitars were sometimes too light in the mix, but you could grasp Fogarty's overall vision and appreciate the creative potential. Elderthorn released Ewigkeit's 1999 follow-up Starscape, which showed even more alacrity to expand the musical dimensions into space rock while retaining the black metal aesthetics of the demo era. This time, the keyboards blinded you like cosmic quasars, and the guitars were much louder in the mix. Often guided by the high register keyboards and not averse to the occasional 3/4 time signature waltz, Starscape was a seminal release in the UK black metal scene of the late 1990s. Songs like The Return of Planet X and Lightspeed Evolution are what Darkthrone would sound like if they adopted keyboards as their main weapon and relocated to Dusseldorf's EBM scene of the 1980s. Today, we'd call it cosmic black metal, but the term did not exist in 1999. Glowing with melody, grounded in furious aggression, gliding between celestial magnificence and dreamy moments of calm, Ewigkeit's sophomore effort is a cult classic. Fogerty intended Starscape to be a stepping stone to his next opus, titled Land of Fog. Elderthorn's bankruptcy ruined these plans, and it only saw the light of day 3 years after completion when Slovakian label Metal Age Productions added it to their catalogue. Arriving in 2003, Fogerty now views Land of Fog as the first proper Ivy Kite album, which is harsh on his earlier efforts. It retained the atmosphere of his black metal era, but moved the guitar work into a power chord friendly thrash assault. Neither as vicious as Slayer, nor as sedate as the Megadeth tone of the Risk era, Fogerty used his 6-string instrument as a secondary weapon. Instead, the snarl of his raspy voice and the call of the organ preset led the way on his third record. The transformation of sound was organic rather than iconoclastic. Supersonic Blue Thunder premiered a new vocal style that resembled a cross-punk, hoping to rouse a stadium rock audience into action. Blues piano licks reared their head throughout this song. By contrast, Not All There showed a clear Anathema influence in the solemn vocal harmonies and spacious arrangements. Likewise, The Only Way leaned on the funereal minimalism of Joy Division and the lonely sparkle of a piano sequence to open the listener's heart. Fogerty's ability to do this with a heavy guitar distortion and a neoclassical sweep was even more impressive. The psychedelic prog metal of Land of Fog put Ivy Kite on the radar of Earache Records, who secured the rights to release 2004's Radio Ixtlan. A galloping metal album with traces of Hawkwind and Black Sabbath at its core, this high-tempo LP saw Fogerty double down on the quality of his riffs and give more space for the bass to carve out the hooks. The difference here was his emphasis on writing choruses. Though his voice had not evolved into anything resembling a rock singer, his ability to switch from growling to a punk rock snarl gave the music an unusual cogency that merged the big beat dance music of the mid-90s into an industrial metal template. Nothing encapsulated this better than the 9-minute epic Journey to Ixtlan, which circled around a tribal chant and evolved into a spoken word haze of synth loops before reigniting as a sample-driven thrash affair. Its volatile dynamics and linear structure are the definition of prog, but its spirit is avant-garde. The blackened trance metal of Conquer the Fear had all the ingredients for a cyberpunk anthem and an excess of maudlin loneliness to disqualify it from the dance floor. This paradox confused people. Ulver emancipated from their black metal roots when they released 1998's metallic trip-hop classic Themes from William Blake's The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. Dod Heimsgaard did the same in 1999 with their industrial black metal breakthrough 666 International. Did Ivy Kite though have this type of record in its repertoire? Fogerty spent the next 12 months creating a new concept album. This time it would be a meditation on conspiracy theories, requiring a year of research before he could record it in the studio. He soon noticed that Earache Records had little interest in it. Anything that was a bit out of their comfort zone to listen to, they effectively blacklisted in the office and didn't actively promote. He told Scream Blast Repeat in February 2021, "It's even worse when you have people who are harbouring grudges on behalf of other totally unrelated and jealous individuals. The release of Conspiratus was in itself worthy of a conspiracy theory." Conspiratus was Ivy Kite's last album for Earache Records, and it continued to be guided by the hands-free synth arpeggiator as the metallic riffs worked around it. Once again, it revealed many personalities, though Fogerty abandoned the black metal vocals. The harmonica-infused doom metal of Square Sunrise pulsated like a therion Danse Macabre, while the Nightmare Institution mixed the new wave of British heavy metal with gothic EBM timbers. Opeth had already shown that a band could evolve from extreme metal to progressive rock for 2003's Damnation, and Ivy Kite appeared to be on the same trajectory with the song Transcend the Senses. For James Fogerty, this sparked the realisation that he no longer had anything in common with the music he loved in his youth. If his artistic impulses were leading him away from metal, how could Ivy Kite justify its future existence? In 2007, Fogerty disbanded Ivy Kite, lamenting that metal is mostly out of date, out of touch with its origins, and, worst of all, conservative in the extreme. It was a bitter end to a career fraught with setbacks for an artist who never achieved his potential. Yet his role as a co-founder of another avant-garde black metal group in 1998 would cement his place in the English metal scene. Under the name Jalda Boath, James Fogarty co-founded experimental black metal group The Meads of Asphodel in 1998 while writing Starscape. His partner for this project was Hertfordshire recluse Metatron, aka Kryn Hawk, who provided vocals for the band's first 3 demos. They released their debut album, The Excommunication of Christ, in 2001 through Surrey-based imprint Supernal Music, with Fogarty writing, recording and performing all instruments except voice. Heavy on bass settings and with a guitar distortion hostile enough to strip skin from bone, The Excommunication of Christ is a black and thrash metal record with many left turns. To categorise it as eclectic does not do it justice. The Meads of Asphodel always had a clear vision for their art as a martial form of music. They wanted to rock and to roll in full costume to the historical events that changed the world. Angel Whore is as merry as the drunken spectators at a medieval jousting event with strained vocal roars. The Watchers of Catal Hayuk could grace any mayhem record despite its sobering late afternoon organ melodies. Fogarty's guitar work is much thicker in texture and sharper in picking action, often using the harmonic minor scales to give it a Middle Eastern feel. Flutes appear with the frequency of shore larks on UK beaches. Sometimes you can hear the proto metal of the 1970s underneath the high-tempo rhythms and malevolent vocals, and you don't need to look far for unusual flavours. A techno sequence lays the foundations for the galloping metal thrust of Weeping Tears of Angel Light, while much of side B carries on the good work of the early Venom records in a psychedelic way. Many assumed the Meads of Asphodel would fold when Fogarty departed from the project in 2002. As the sole musician and composer, he left Metatron with a headache. How could their singer continue the project without a songwriter? His answer was to bring in drummer Urak Baramil, aka Sonny O'Jolly, and multi-instrumentalist James Tate. They relaunched in 2003 with their sophomore album Exhuming the Grave of Yeshua and won immediate critical acclaim. Darker, more experimental, armed with the raw energy and defiance of Motorhead, and open to influences beyond rock and metal, this record made these contrasting timbers its raison d'être. God is Rome and Utopia encapsulated the crusty thrash approach with moments of jangly guitar pop and imperious keyboard tones. Nobody could walk away from Exhuming the Grave of Yeshua without feeling invigorated by its chivalrous heavy metal, yet the incorporation of New Order's electronic indie rock and Jethro Tull's woodwind prog were unlike anything in extreme metal at the time, and this was loud and obnoxious and committed to the spirit of Sodom's thrash metal brilliance, despite flirting with breakbeats and gypsy folk stylings. Ex-Hawkwind 4-stringer Alan Davey contributed bass on 3 tracks, joined by his ex-bandmate Hugh Lloyd Langton on lead guitar. Sai's Mirai Kawishima contributed keyboards to the song Blood Blasted Holy War. It ended with a 10-minute diatribe against the Supreme Being, repeating the hypnotic message that God is fucking with you. Exhuming the Grave of Yeshua landed at number 8 in the Terrorizer Top 40 Albums of 2003, above Opeth and Cult of Luna. It encouraged them to push the boundaries on their 2005 follow-up, Damascus Steel, where they returned the services of Davey, Lloyd Langton and Kawashima as guest musicians. Released on Halloween 2005, the group's third effort moved away from the crusty metal extravaganza and into a dramatic black metal storm. The vocals were louder and gratuitous in their gory delivery, the blast beats were more prominent, and the ambient keyboard atmospherics mixed with the desert heat of Arabic percussion. Songs like Hollow Womb of Suicide employed choir vocals to enshroud the guitars and headbanging drums in a mystical layer of contemplation. A smooth trumpet breezed through the middle section of Satanic Black Nubian Pharaohs. The colourful string arrangements and glowing melodies of the Gods Who Mock Us did not diminish under the weight of strangled throat vocals and spasms of metallic violence. Indeed, the second half of this song transitioned into a succession of easy listening interludes a la Mr. Bungle before plunging into one last act of blood carnage at the finale. The nucleus of Christianity is in Jewish Judaism, and yet the religion is embraced as a Western ideal cast upon the world from its adopted Roman arms, said Metatron in a rare interview in 2005. The lyrical themes of Damascus Steel explored the tribal divisions of the Middle East and the unfolding insurgency against the American occupation of Iraq. It transplanted them into an end-of-days nightmare centered on the motto, death means nothing, life means less. As emerging darlings of the UK underground, you might have expected the Meads of Asphodel to continue their 2-year cycle of releasing new albums, but they spent the next 5 years releasing EPs and punk covers before signing to Candlelight Records for 2010's The Murder of Jesus the Jew. The album told the story of Jesus, the Jewish rabbi, and presented it as an epic in a progressive metal setting to accompany the ups and downs of his life. Despite the occasional venture into catchy dance pop and exotica, it operated from a black metal base and inserted moments of divine bliss into its extreme aggression. Indeed, the theatrical leanings of Addicted to God adopted a musical narrative like Jesus Christ Superstar and sandwiched the plot development into a rubble of wild metallic fury. It was an ambitious end to the decade for one of England's most iconoclastic extreme metal bands of this era. Another group to emerge from England's Southeast Underground were Code, who started as a one-man project of Iot, aka Andrews McIver. It expanded to include Hex Vessel vocalist Kvost, aka Matthew McNerney, for their 2002 demo, and solidified further into a 5-piece band for the release of the 2005 debut Novo Gloaming. Here, Derd Heimsgaard and ex-Vedboons Ende legend Vikotnik joined them on bass under the pseudonym of Viper. Former Oversticksman Eric Lancelot assumed the drum stool. This was a supergroup in the making, but they went about their business like Satyricon, armed with the melodies of a prog rock bassist. Fiendish and fun, lo-fi yet muscular, dissonant but never stifling. The debut LP was not afraid to incorporate the radio warmth of 1940s vocal pop into its hostile distortion. Those already familiar with Vedboons Ende would have no trouble enjoying the sorrowful lunacy of the music. Songs like A Cloud-Formed Teardrop Asylum employed deadpan harmonies over doom metal timings and found melodies in Kvost's melancholy head voice. It sounded like Arcturus as the house band at a black tie dinner, and it finished above the Norwegian group's Sideshow Symphonies LP in the Terrorizer Top 40 albums of 2005. Kvost took over microphone duties for Derd Heimsgaard for their 2007 album Supervillain Outcast, which put Code on hold until he rejoined the band in 2008. This time they enlisted At the Gates drummer Adrian Erlandson to do the session work, and Vikotnik remained on bass duty. 2009's sophomore effort, Resplendent Grotesque, is a cleaner production with the double kick drums prominent in the mix and Iot's crunchy guitar tone at the centre of it. Like Akakoki, it employed Voivod's dissonant thrash riffing with baritone vocal harmonies, expert crooning and hostile screaming. Indeed, the unique feature of Code's second album is its maudlin singing style imposed on a discordant metal landscape. Slimmed down to 34 minutes, Resplendent Grotesque received nowhere near the attention it deserved for its highbrow vocal arrangement. It was also the last album to feature Kvost and Vikotnik. Iot recruited from the London and Surrey regions when the band returned in 2013, ending the supergroup identity but continuing with their unique sound for a further 3 albums. London was not the only English city producing experimental metal in the first decade of the 21st century. Middlesbrough duo, the Axis of Perdition, emerged at the same time as Birmingham extreme metal sensations Anal Nathrak. They merged black metal horror with industrial noise and constructed their lengthy compositions from an ambient, atmospheric bass. Macabre sound effects and distorted screams were as ubiquitous as the dissonant guitar shapes in their 2003 debut LP, The Ich Neumann Method and Less Welcome Techniques. Here, muffled voices and excess amp gain fought with programmed drums for primacy in the mix. Whereas most bands around this time adapted digital recording software to enhance their sound, the Axis of Perdition did the opposite. What could Pro Tools do that was not included in the operating manual? Pushing the audio mixer's LED meter to a flashing red for most of the action gave the listener no room to escape. Add unmelodious guitar note groupings to this bass-heavy soundscape, and it sounded like an aeroplane nosediving into the ocean. This was not a spooky and harmless danse macabre. This was audio terror. But were the demons on the outside and waiting to get in? Or were they already in your head? Axis of Perdition plays something there isn't words for yet, exclusively, said the CD booklet for the Ich Neumann Method. They were right. These compositions felt like the uncontrollable hallucinations of a diseased mind. Terrorizer magazine loved it and voted it at number 4 in the top 40 albums of 2003. Music like this would never be a live concern when so much of it depended on a painstaking devotion to sound design. The studio was where the Axis of Perdition excelled. 2005's deleted scenes from the Transition Hospital moved even further into cinematic music, albeit of a psychological terror dimension. Slower in tempo and more technical in its guitar work, it embraced the dissonance of the fretboard, yet the morbid choral chants and crisp tone of the double kick drums moved it closer to death rather than black metal. And that's if you could call it metal. With no sustained kick snare rhythms in any of the 8 tracks, the record relied on long passages of disorienting sound effects and relentless dread-inducing tones. Creaking machines and humming electronics did not just fill the gaps, they created the gaps for other samples to spread their unease. In a break with their debut, they also added jazz guitars and silky pianos amongst the ambient power electronics. It was more musical, yet somehow harder to pin down. Anyone who survived the 55 minutes of mental horror might decide against doing it again to protect their health and well-being. Deleted scenes from the Transition Hospital was a brave move for the Axis of Perdition. They didn't use the term ambient lightly. Much of their music on album number 2 subsisted without percussion or aggressive guitars. The soundtrack of cult Japanese video game Silent Hill was just as inspirational to them as the music of Gorguts or White House. Making the listener feel panic and dread ought to be a recipe for alienating music lovers, but it came with no sadistic snigger or hatred for humanity. But could you handle the horror? The group expanded to a 5-piece for 2009's Urfa album, and the question was even harder to answer. A 4-year absence between records produced a double LP of 1 hour and 30 minutes. It began and ends with Pylon. Pylon stands in the doorway beckoning me in, announces the narrator in the opening track. Side A contains 6 cuts called Grief of the Unclean, divided into 6 parts, and takes the listener on a vivid journey through a swirling drum world interspersed with scarce guitar solos and dissonant piano passages. Close your eyes and you can imagine you're listening to an audiobook. Wailing human voices hawk in the background. A narrator talks in an eloquent but angst-ridden English accent. I listen for signs of life, but there are none. Though you can switch off for long periods, the words will suck you in again. The band's world of sexual depravity and brutal survivalism is as surreal as it is sickening. 1 minute the narrator's being chased by a hypersexual dog. The next moment, our protagonist is lurching forward to stop himself drowning in vomit. I try to hold back a gobful of sick, but it explodes from the corner of my mouth, bilious, rancid. They didn't use any synthesizers or power electronics here. It was not metal, nor could you call it conventional music with constant rhythms and memorable repetition. Why they needed 5 people to create this was baffling. Side B was much the same, though all musicians locked in for a piece of Voivod-inspired doom metal for the Great Unwashed 2 to remind us that we are listening to music. This did not present a problem if you wanted a story narrated in surround sound atmospherics with content as depraved as Pierre Guillotart's infamous 1967 novel Tomb for 500,000 Soldiers. It takes a strong stomach to sit through the non-musical tedium of Urfa with full attention. the Axis of Perdition realised they might have pushed the concept of ambient metal as far as it could go after this record and returned to a heavier use of guitars and programmed drums for their 2011 album before calling it quits in 2013. Many listeners are still recovering from the trauma of their music and might be unaware that they reformed in 2019 under the new name of An Axis of Perdition. The death metal scene in England in this decade did not blossom into anything remarkable, but it produced some interesting music, none more so than rugby duo Mithras. Formed in 2000 out of the ashes of Imperator, they encountered the same challenges as every other band in this era: how to record technical metal music on a small budget. Their 2002 debut Forever Advancing Legions piqued the interest of the British underground with the same alacrity as Akakoki in 1998. In retrospect, it pulsates with the same ambition as Celtic Frost's early days. The opening title track is martial music for the prospective war criminal rather than the brave fighter. Thunderous organs and sinister drones merge with horn furnishings for 4 minutes of empowering malevolence. You're almost disappointed when they follow it with a standard blast of monosyllabic death metal. The vocals of Rainer Koss are indistinguishable from Dying Fetus and the other clones from this era, which means they're unintelligible most of the time. No audio engineer would be proud of the mix on this record either. On first listen, most of the action feels like tech death music with a loose control of the gears. Leon Mace's drum snares are tuned high in the mix and his stick work is impressive, even if the guitars often drown out his beats. Solos shred through notes with the same gratuitous aggression as Morbid Angel's Triazagdoth. Transitions take place with the certainty of a late train. Guttural vocals slake their thirst with grisly imaginings of the Roman gladiatorial arena. Yet persevering with this album after 3 songs is worthwhile because you never know what's coming next. A vicious noise terror at warp speed can halt and rebuild itself through sinister dungeon synth compositions. Mellifluous baroque music hides among the catacombs and stands out when you can catch glimpses of it. The crunchy pinch harmonic riffing in Wrath of God could grace any groove metal album. Rainer Koss and Leon Macy knew what they wanted to achieve, but they lacked the technology to realise it. In fairness, Forever Advancing Legions is not too far away from death metal darlings Nile, who had everyone's attention in 2002. The only thing that lets it down is the production, which is of a CDR demo quality. This was not a problem for their 2003 successor, Worlds Beyond the Veil, which expanded to over 1 hour and invested in a clearer sound befitting of a technical band. The title track was as ferocious and as bludgeoning as anything in death metal at the time. They ditched the grunting vocal lines in favour of forceful shouting. At full velocity, there were no spaces in this music to breathe, yet Mithras placed a greater emphasis on atmosphere and ambience on album number 2. Guitars reverberated with looping delay effects during long passages of vocal-free exploration. Kick drums motored underneath the riffing like hungry engines. Speed levels accelerated with no fear of imploding. The pauses in between the violence had a meditational quality to them, like Tangerine Dream in a psychedelic haze. There was no background noise here, but you could feel the mist in your nostrils. Songs like Sands of Time would not be out of place on one of the great prog death albums from Chuck Schuldiner. Yet Mithras answered to the term experimental brutal death metal if pushed, and let's be honest, who would want to do that? It's easy to see why Candlelight Records signed them for their next LP. The death metal meets space rock approach of their 2003 opus had few practitioners in the early 2000s, and Behind the Shadows Lie Madness came out after a 4-year gap. Was this still enough time to ruminate on Mithras' ambitious sophomore effort? Album number 3 clocked in at 44 minutes and emphasised the prominence of celestial keyboards and guitar shapes among the vicious tech death assault. Now, they expanded their vocal techniques to include theatrical baritone lines for a call and response effect with the harsher voice delivery. Melodic scale patterns were cleaner and more colourful. The blast beats had more clarity in the mix. Mithras were now a bona fide progressive death metal band with an experimental impulse and an abundance of skull-crushing riffs. Inserting interludes of Gregorian chanting into this note-shredding extravagance made perfect sense. It was easy to forget this band once imitated Morbid Angel. Efforts like Behind the Shadows and To Where the Sun Never Leaves thrived on ascending and descending scale patterns beloved of classical music composers like Philip Glass. The decision of bassist and vocalist Rainer Koss to quit after the album's release is mystifying and ought to have jeopardised their future. Instead, Leon Macy drafted in Australian emigre Sam Bean, ex-vocalist of the Berserker, to take over, and they crowned 2009 with triumphant performances at Damnation Festival and the famous Brutal Assault extravaganza in the Czech Republic. He never recorded anything with Mithras, but Bean kept the seat warm for Koss to return in 2011 for their Time Never Lasts comeback EP. They never received the attention to match their artistic ambition, but few bands produced this type of cosmic death metal in the early 2000s. Today, it's a burgeoning micro-genre, and you wonder how many of its practitioners have heard the music of Mithras. The label that released the first two Mithras albums was the enterprise of Scottish experimental death doom artist Serenade. The Glasgow group released 2 LPs in the 1990s and exited the scene in 2001 with their swan song record, The Serpent's Dance. Released on Golden Lake Productions, the third full-length recording used higher tempos and chunkier riffing than their first two efforts and employed the harmonic minor scales as well as esoteric folk music as a core part of its sound. In relation to the former, artists like Metallica, see Creeping Death from 1984, and Death, see Zombie Ritual from 1987, had adopted the 3-semitone gap in their guitar scales to furnish their riffs with an exotic Middle Eastern flavour. Indeed, Death became famous for it in their recordings of the 1990s. Serenade were not alone in focusing on this aspect of their music, but they made it serve their progressive structures and showed the underground scene how it could be adapted into an atmospheric setting while also incorporating Western classical piano into their interludes. They were alone in Scotland and made the most of their isolation by running Golden Lake Productions as a record label, fanzine and web community at the height of the CD consumption boom. Serenade disappeared after Golden Lake Productions closed in 2006, but they were important artists and patrons in both Scotland and the wider UK in this era of experimental metal. Returning back to England, the final band to leave their mark on the English experimental scene in the 2000s started as the solo project of Godflesh founder Justin Broderick. As pioneers of industrial metal, Godflesh did not qualify for inclusion in this study because their genre is a tangible thing replicated by many artists. Since emerging from Birmingham with 1989's seminal Street Cleaner LP, the duo's bleak, mechanical sound has produced some of the most distinctive expressions of human alienation and disillusionment in the history of Western music. Bass heavy with low-tuned guitars, aggressive vocals, and grinding drum sequences, their 1992 Pure album now receives a retrospective acknowledgement for its influence on the development of post-metal, not least because of its inspiration for bands like Neurosis. They also received an equal amount of attention from major labels as from critics in the early 1990s, signing to Columbia for 1994's Selfless on the ridiculous expectation that they might reproduce the commercial success of Nine Inch Nails. It shifted 180,000 units and saw them dropped a year later, though the album's more orthodox rock identity was still at the cutting edge of contemporary industrial music. By 2002, the duo found themselves opening for bands that influenced, leaving bassist and co-founder BC Green demoralised enough to quit on the verge of a North American tour with Fear Factory and Strapping Young Lad. Broderick tried to keep it together but suffered a nervous breakdown on the eve of another North American tour in support of High on Fire and ISIS, and refused to be picked up for his ride to Birmingham Airport. Godflesh disbanded in July 2002, leaving their frontman with urgent bills to pay to those affected by the tour's cancellation. His only option was to continue writing music at a low point in his life. That project was Jesu. Jesu is a continuation of Godflesh and takes its name from the final track on their 2001 album. But that song was a rare flicker of light in a suffocating world of black and grey, and it captured how Broderick felt at the time. The resulting self-titled album, released in 2004 via Hydra Head Records, was Broderick's attempt to write coherent songs with daydreaming tones and aggressive beats caked in the usual frustration and human despair. This was the definition of avant-garde metal when one observes the sorrowful lo-fi melody underneath the layers of distortion. Godflesh never had this paradox in their sound, and few artists had attempted to introduce shoegaze textures into a harsh industrial metal landscape in 2004. The low-volume vocals had a funereal dignity about them at odds with the oil-stained beats and loops. Broderick's guitars were closer to doom metal than anything, often eschewing the grandiosity associated with Neurosis, but retaining their tempos. It won him instant acclaim at a time when he had no idea if a future existed for him in the music industry. Celtic Frost's Tom G. Warrior was an instant fan. A tour with post-metal heavyweights ISIS followed in 2005. The sentimental melodies surge with sorrow and optimism in the 2007 successor LP, Conqueror, which delved deeper into the fusion of sludge metal and shoegaze. Mixing dream pop with fuzzy guitar distortion and hard-hitting doom metal drum combinations, album number 2 feels like Broderick at his happiest realization of solitude, yet the human loneliness is moving. It conjures images of the Melvins sharing a rehearsal room with My Bloody Valentine and bringing in M83 to mix it. The debut album captured the nihilistic despair of the early records by The Cure, but this one adopted a melancholia shrouded in pastel-coloured textures. Broderick's singing voice was stronger and louder in the mix and more open in its search for melody. Yet one could not ignore the engulfing wall of sound built around the throbbing guitars. It did not diminish the listening experience, pushing it to 57 minutes, when you could submerge yourself in its embrace and feel empowered by its noisy distortion at the same time. Close your eyes and you could hear the ambient tones of U2's The Joshua Tree, whether intentional or not. Nirvana might have ended up like this if Kurt Cobain lived, abandoned his aggressive side, and wrote distorted music with a lump in his throat. 2009's Infinity was audacious enough to appear as a solitary 49-minute song for the next long play effort of Jesu. It started like a nod to the minimalist electronica that Depeche Mode and co brought back into fashion in the mid-2000s using analog synthesizers, yet the bleak industrial noise never left Broderick. The continuation from Godflesh is evident in this ambitious album, as is the reverse influence of Neurosis on Broderick's music. If anything, the heavy parts are too harsh for the melancholy nostalgia at the heart of the melody, creating a contrast that makes you wonder what Little House on the Prairie might look like if directed by extremist filmmaker Lars von Trier. Infinity marked the point where Jesu strayed further than imagined into ambient introspection, and Broderick shifted the sound back towards the doom-laden mope rock of Conqueror for 2011's Ascension and 2013's Every Day I Get Closer to the Light from Which I Came. A Godflesh reformation in 2009 led to a string of high-profile festival appearances and resulted in Broderick directing his creative energies to the group's 2014 comeback album, A World Lit Only by Fire. Yet the years where Jesu was his sole artistic outlet produced one of the few successful experiments in dream pop and atmospheric doom metal, and you can hear its influence on the many bands that try to merge metal with My Bloody Valentine.
Woo, that was another long one. I didn't expect part 3A to be nearly an hour in length. It came in at 7,000 words. I really enjoyed making it, actually. I'm not sure what I'm going to do for part 3B. I've got 4 or 5 ideas. I've already done the research for most of them. Should I go for grindcore, black metal, death metal, post-metal, mathcore? Not too sure. Even progressive avant-garde artists like Modern of the Well, they did that album Bath, didn't they, from 2001, which is a classic. Definitely going to come up in this documentary. So I will let you wait in suspense for part 3B. I'll make it a surprise. So part 3A was looking at the avant-garde metal scene in England. Who knows what part 3B will be based on the hints that I've just given you now. Take care.